Hey guys, this time we're talking about how to defend conclusions, and I'm sure you have because it was from last week. But if you have not had a chance to look at the video on forming conclusions, please go back and watch that one first, just because this will make a lot more sense if you have seen that one. Um, because, well, I mean, it just will. I don't. It just will. So, defending conclusions is actually a little bit more challenging than forming conclusions because now you are in front of an audience and they're going to ask probing questions. And it doesn't have to be hard, but what I would really recommend is kind of anticipating what they might ask. And I mean, I've been on a lot of these committees, so I can tell you what they're going to ask, to be honest with you. But you have to anticipate these particular questions and then kind of think, okay, well, how would I respond to that? What do I know that I can apply in these cases, right? So, we've got the data that we looked at last module that's about the political perspective and how it impacts perceptions of violent crime or mass shooting events. And what we concluded last time was that political perspective, in this case Republican versus independent, political perspective only has a significant impact on people's perceptions of gun control with regard to mass shootings, right? Not on immigration, not on mental health care, nor do they have just political perspective seem to impact whether or not people believe these are preventable, right? So we said, yes, political perspective does seem to have a significant impact, but only within the factor of gun control, right? So we said yes, but we qualified it. Okay? If you present this to a committee, right, I'm going to be devil's advocate in this case. You're going to present this to the committee as a conclusion. What they will ask you if you present this, they will ask you something like, why? That's the favorite question of a committee member. Why? Why do we see this pattern? Why is it only within gun control when issues like immigration and mental health are heavily politicized in this country? Why do we only see political perspective impacting those two factors, right? So you have to be ready for that question. You have to know, okay, I know why I think this is happening, and you have to be on the spot with it and say, I mean, for example, there's any number of things you could say there, but you could talk about how all of these, while all of these are politicized issues, the only area where it becomes a significant contrast between political ideologies is within the gun control. So it's not that those other areas aren't politicized, they just don't seem to have as much weight. You could also bring up that the data supports that gun control seems to be the central issue that people associate with this type of violence, right? But that's what I'm saying is that why question, the last thing you want in the world is to have them say why, and you just got nothing, right? You have to anticipate that why question. Another question they might ask you in this situation too, when defending your conclusion is, well, where would the Democrats fit in all of this, right? Because we got Republican and Independent. How do you think the Democrats would lean? And you could say something like, for example, since we can't run more than two groups within a t-test, you could say, well, an ANOVA comparing all three political perspectives indicated that there was a significant main effect of political party or political ideology on the gun control items, but not the other ones, right? So you can have already run this. Remember we talked about post hoc analysis in a previous lecture? Run the post hoc analysis so that when they ask you, hey, what about Democrats? How do Democrats fit into this? You've got the answer, right? What I'm trying to get at with these defending these conclusions is you do not want to be called out and not know an answer, right? You gotta anticipate what the questions are going to ask. The other thing I want you to know when it comes to defending your conclusions, right, is that you have to accept the possibility of other um, perspectives, right? Alternative interpretations. Right, so it would be easy to say, "Oh, yeah, clearly, there's a big political divide between on gun control between different political parties." Sure, absolutely. But if you look at those means, right, go back and look at those means again, especially for the first two items. Let me use my cursor here so you can see what I'm talking about. Right here, these two means and these two means, right? If you notice, Republicans identify with a 2.41, Independents identify with a 2.89, right? So basically, both groups answered between 2 and 3. And if you look at what I've talked about with regard to our answer key, 2 is disagree, 3 is neither agree nor disagree, right? So in this case, both groups are saying, actually, tighter gun control laws probably wouldn't have helped. Even the independents are saying that. We're only seeing less than a half a point difference and how these people respond, right? Likewise, if we go just below that, for the other perspective, right? 0.171, 1.43 rather, 1.71, excuse me, and 1.43. In this case, we have a difference of basically a quarter of a point, right? Just a little bit more than a quarter of a point. But in this case, they're also agreeing with each other for the most part. So you might have a committee member that's like, hey, if you look at the means, they're not really saying anything different at all. There is a significant difference, but is it an important difference? And if you look at it that way, it's okay to concede and say, hey, you know what? To be honest with you, no, it isn't. While it is significant, it doesn't represent a substantial difference. They are both essentially agreeing with each other. And once again, if you look at the means all the way down the board, they are essentially agreeing with each other. Not a single one of these means indicates that one group says yes and another group says no, in terms of average, right? There's going to be difference in participants, but across an average. So if a committee member tells you, well, yeah, it's significant, but does it really matter? It's okay to say no. No, it does not matter, right? What you don't want to do, as we talked about in the previous module, I don't know why I always point like this to the past, right? But in the previous module, we talked about how you have to be able to form conclusions that are not entirely or substantially subjective. And if you do and you go to defend it, then it's really easy to punch holes in that, right? The data is here and your committee has access to this data, right? It's not like the committee doesn't know what the numbers say. They can look at these means and they're smart enough to know those means don't actually show much of a contrast, right? So while you can say, and it's supportable, yeah, there's a significant difference based on political ideology with regard to gun control laws. Is it a substantial difference? Is it a noteworthy difference? Not really. And I point this out because these are the sort of things that your committee is really going to want to look at closer. And they're not trying to call you out. Let me be clear on this. The mentality is not to call you out. The mentality is to know more about your study and in some ways test how much you know. They want to know if you know your stuff. And if you look at those numbers and you're like, oh, no, there's a massive difference. No. Don't confuse significant with substantial, right? So defending these conclusions, it is okay to acknowledge other perspectives. It is okay to acknowledge other interpretations. In fact, if someone presents something where you think, oh, that makes more sense, you can acknowledge that. And you say, hey, you know what? Actually, that's probably a better way to describe it. Absolutely, right? That is how you defend these, because you want to think of this as a conversation, as a dialogue. You're saying, oh, I looked at the data and I think A is happening. If when a committee member says, well, what about B? I think maybe it's B. It is okay to have a discourse and say, oh, yeah, well, it could be B if you think of it this way, but it could also be A if you think of it that way. This is what your committee is looking for, that you can have an informed discussion about a topic that you now know very, very well, right? So as I talked about in the previous module, you want to make sure that any conclusions you form are ones that you can go essentially toe-to-toe with your committee members and defend well, but also be willing to process, I don't want to say criticism, but process other perspectives in a way that leads to a meaningful dialogue where clearly you know your stuff and the committee sees that.